Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Action is the Antidote. I'm happy to be here with Daphne and Briante, and that we're here today to speak with you all. So I'm actually going to first pass it over to Daphne. She's a youth activist, an organizer, and a storyteller, just to give her 30-second tidbits about herself.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you all today. As Jasmine mentioned, I am a 24-year-old youth activist working on the intersections of disability justice, the climate crisis, and gun violence prevention. I also am the founder of Ballot, which is an absentee ballot collection initiative aiming to harness the power of young people at the ballot box. I am so excited again to be here with you all today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daphne. And I'm now passing it over to Briante McCorkle. She's the director of Georgia Conservation Voters. You want to share 30 seconds about you?
I am Briante McCorkle. I am the executive director at Georgia Conservation Voters. We do work here in Georgia to protect the environment, to organize communities around climate and environmental justice issues. We have a more political arm that gets involved in the legislative session, as well as during elections to support elected officials and candidates who are being champions for this issue. I'm super excited to be here with you all today.
Awesome. So we're going to dive into our session. I'm Jasmine Davenport, formerly Sanders. I'm the executive director of Our Climate, which is a climate change advocacy organization empowered by youth grassroots movement working on intersectional climate justice policy solutions. So today we're here to talk about how action is the antidote. And we all know that climate change is a complex intersectional topic that can sometimes be very overwhelming to think about. What's the framework for approaching this huge topic? How do you decide where to put your energy? And I think let's start off with Briante.
So I think I swam in this for years, right? It's such a big topic. I mean, we're talking about saving the planet, and the planet is a pretty big place. And I think what's been helpful for me is to sort of partition out the work in a sense. So I look at it in two different lanes. So one is climate change, right? It's the issue that's impacting us, that we're all facing, the crisis that's already upon us. What we need to do to solve climate change is just relentlessly reduce carbon emissions, right? If we're going to slow it down, it's really just a game of slowing down the carbon emissions that have been causing it in the first place, transitioning our society to one that doesn't need to produce as many emissions for us to live, to survive and thrive on this planet. That's one part of it. The other way that I look at it is environmental justice. There are communities who, regardless of climate change, have been on the front lines of pollution and have been, breathing in poisoned air, breathing in polluted water, living on land that's contaminated with various chemicals. And that work is also incredibly important for us to tackle. But it sometimes is, marginalized and pushed to the side because it's not as urgent as solving, climate change and reducing carbon emissions. So I think it's really important that we look at both of those issues and we tackle them both simultaneously, but understand that they are not the same problem, that the solutions to them, while they're solutions that could benefit both things, they are nuanced, they are different, right? For example, if we're tackling climate change, we could talk about going electric and investing in electric vehicle infrastructure. So that's the way that we get around. But then where does that, intersect with the environmental justice lens? How do communities who can't afford electric vehicles also partake in this transition, also knowing that they're the ones breathing in poisoned air right now, and that their children of color, lower income children, have asthma rates that are higher rate? That's a different topic. It's connected and they can be addressed simultaneously, but you do have to examine both of them thoroughly, right, to come up with that solution. And the final thing that I like to look at it, so there's climate change, there's environmental justice. And so when you're looking at climate change, you're like, all right, how do I reduce carbon emissions? Where do I start there? Well, I got to say that, I mean, there were so many solutions, right? Stop eating meat, like drive an electric vehicle, like turn off your light, like where do you start? I thought something that was really helpful in grounding me was the Drawdown book. So I'm like here dropping a book here, but the Drawdown book is a book where they took a comprehensive look at all of the different potential solutions to climate change, the different ways that we can mitigate or reduce our carbon use, and then they rank them in order of efficacy. They did a ranking that's purely based on how much carbon emissions will the solution actually reduce or eliminate. But then they also took a lens at some more intersectional things like social justice. And so they have a list that's just, if you're just looking at carbon, these are the top solutions. But when you look at these social justice lenses, things like educating women rise to the top of the list. And so I encourage people to really take some time to sit with that book and identify the different solutions and to really start to tackle the ones that stand out to you as something that you're interested in and you want to get engaged in. And I'll conclude that some states have even gone so far as to take that Drawdown book and to turn it into a state specific roadmap. Here in Georgia, our universities, UGA, Georgia Tech, Emory, they came together and they took a look at that Drawdown book, did this research and figured out what solutions in the book were relevant for Georgia based on Georgia's economy, based on what could work here in this state. So now we have Drawdown Georgia, which has a very specific set of 5 different areas that we want to tackle here. Electricity is definitely one, building materials, food and agriculture, land use, and transportation are the top 5, which make a lot of sense if you live here in Georgia, that those are the solutions here for our state. So if you're in Georgia, the Drawdown map is even more specific, the Georgia Drawdown, but everyone else I think can benefit from that Drawdown book.
Love that. I will have to share that with my sister who lives in Georgia because she's always looking for ways to how can she further, be involved. So it's good to hear that Georgia is even further along than other states in that way. Daphne, how about for you? Briante mentioned the word intersectional a few times, and I'd love for you to break that down and also talk to us about how do you decide where to put your energy in this effort?
Sure. So I think intersectionality is a word that often gets thrown around, but the amount of people who actually understand what that means is probably less than 1%. And for me, intersectionality looks like taking a step back and looking at an issue based on all the different uh, sort of triggers and all the different communities that an issue affects. Um, I think when we talk about the climate crisis, we have seen that the leaders of this space have been predominantly white cisgender individuals, but those are not the people who are most affected by the climate crisis. Um, so when you're talking about intersectionality, it's not necessarily about making sure that everyone is included because that's an easy thing to do. It's about making sure that the people whose voices are needed most in this movement, the voices of those who are most affected by the climate crisis, are at the front lines or are at the have the front row seat at the table. I also think it's important to understand that intersectionality is about knowing when you step into the spotlight and when you step out of the spotlight. That it's not always going to be about you. It's about using your platform, your power, and your voice to say, okay, this is a conversation I can contribute to. And maybe there's is another conversation I can't contribute to, but I can use my platform to elevate those who can best contribute to that conversation. And for me, that really drives home the reason why I do this work as a young person, as someone with a disability. Um, I wasn't seeing disabled folks being included in the conversation around how to solve the climate crisis. And disabled folks live at uh, double jeopardy or multiple jeopardy situations. So we're not only facing the effects of the climate crisis, we're dealing with housing insecurity, we're dealing with reproductive justice issues, we're dealing with um, police violence, we're dealing with so many other issues that do not allow us to even fully encapsulate or comprehend how we are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Because if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you don't know how you're going to pay for your next doctor's appointment, how are you even going to take the second to think about how the climate crisis is personally affecting your life? Um, so I think for me, it's making sure that not only does the general population understand that disabled people are experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis, but that people and siblings in the disabled community also understand that the climate crisis is an issue that we should be amplifying and using our voice to combat. And one of the one of the ways that I do that is through my work with my nonprofit Box the Ballot. My first time voting was in the 2016 election. I was a sophomore in college and using the absentee ballot system to vote. And I had no idea how to utilize the system because no one had ever taken the time to teach me about it. And it's something that is not often spoken about as an option for getting your ballot in. And I thought to myself, I consider myself a pretty politically savvy person. And if I didn't know how to use this process, imagine how many other young people didn't know how to use this process. And that really scared me because every person's vote matters and every person's voice matters. So if we were missing ballots getting to the ballot box, how many people's voices were not being heard? And just for context, 4 million young people turn 18 every single year. So when we reach midterm elections, that's 8 million young people who are eligible to vote. And when we reach presidential elections, that's 16 million new young people who are eligible to vote. Young people between the ages of 18 to 29 are poised to become the largest voting demographic that America has ever seen, which means that if Gen Z comes out to vote at a rate of 1 in 3, compared to the rate that we vote now at a rate of 1 in 4, we'd be able to flip any election in this country that we wanted to. The country would reflect and look like the most diverse, the most innovative, and the most progressive generation to date. And I think that that's so powerful. But the only way that we can do that is by making sure that young people utilize every single avenue to get their ballots in. And people always ask me why are the climate crisis and voting justice tied together? And I think it's about understanding that we have to be able to cast our ballots in a way that push forward climate positive legislation. So a huge part of my work with Box the Ballot is not only getting those ballots in, but it's about educating young people on the issues that they care about but may not have a whole complete understanding on. So we provide educational pamphlets to young people who utilize our services to teach them about issues like the climate crisis in a hyper local regional way relating to the states that they live in and the communities that they are part of. And one of the most amazing pieces of feedback that we've gotten from our young people is that not only do they feel more empowered and more educated and more sort of ready to cast the ballots, but they're also using the knowledge that we are giving them to, for the first time in their lifetimes, have intersectional voting in their households. So these young people often live with their parents and their grandparents and their cousins and their siblings. And for the first time, we're seeing not only the young people voting in these households, but we're seeing whole households voting together. And for the first time, many of these people are first generation, first time voters. And because of our pamphlets and things of that nature that are educating folks on the climate crisis and various other issues, we're seeing people who previously haven't voted before going out and casting their ballots. And I think that the more we continue to link this through line together, that I know it's really easy to feel disillusioned and discouraged with electoral politics right now. And I feel like every single day is a different and new dumpster fire in electoral politics. And I get it, it's really hard. But I think the more that we shape our politics to look like the people who are part of our communities, and Georgia has done an amazing job with this, with Stacey Abrams leading the forefront. And I think the more that we link the climate crisis and voting, will have more communities understanding that their ballot can really be one of the strongest tickets going forward into passing climate legislation.
Wow, so many huge numbers and gems just shared. I think this is such a fruitful conversation already. And I could take this in multiple directions, from the interlinkage between voting rights and passing climate and clean energy policies. But first, before I go there, I actually want to dive into sitting on this panel right now. We have 3 women of color who advocate on a daily basis. Statistics have proven that climate change disproportionately impacts frontline communities the most. Frontline communities, also called environmental justice communities, include communities of color, they include low-income communities and coastal communities, but they also contain certain demographics of people who feel the burdens of climate change heavier than others, from women, children, the elderly, disabled persons, people without housing, LGBTQ+, and more. Oftentimes, we're dealing with these several complex issues. So my question for the both of you is, why should climate change matter to historically ignored communities and groups? We have to go out and we speak to our communities all the time. What are those 1 or 2 reasons you all share with the historically communities and groups that we both identify with and ones we work with, into why they need to be in this fight, in this movement? Briante, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to talk about this. Why should women of color, communities of color, marginalized people, people who share marginalized identities care about this? Well, the answer is they already do. This is, it's already something that's really important to them. If we do, we've seen polling, Georgia specific polling, nationwide polling, university polling, political polling, all the polling and research that shows that women, people of color, again, the people who are sharing marginalized identities care about climate the most. They're the most concerned, they're the most alarmed, they're the most willing and the most willing to take action on the issue because they feel already the impacts of climate hitting their communities. And again, sometimes it's manifesting in health issues. Sometimes it's manifesting in economic issues. Like right now, we're going through a pretty serious energy price crunch that everyone's feeling, but especially people who are on the lower income end of the spectrum. So the thing is these communities are already feeling the impacts, even if they don't have the scientific analysis of like, oh, it's because of like this climate thing and the megatons and this is how, like, they don't maybe have all that language, but they're like, you know what, we should care about our planet. Our planet's obviously sick. We're sick as a result. I want to raise healthy families. I want a healthier future for people. This is something inherent as a shared value in these groups, and it continues to show up through the polling. Even if we look at, climate support in Georgia, we've got really great data that shows us where the strongest supporters are of climate change. The people who are most alarmed about this topic are, well, they're in the urban areas in our state, which are where a lot of POC live, a lot of people of color, a lot of women, a lot of young people live in these urban areas. So it's clear that the support is already there for this issue. Again, even if the deeper scientific analysis isn't there. In some cases it is there, but in some cases it's not. People definitely resonate and want to take action on this issue. I think what happens with people thinking that communities of color are not engaged or they don't care about this is because, again, when you look at the environmental movement, it's historically been very white-led, very white dominated. That has manifested or has shown up in the imagery that you see associated with the environmental movement, the language that's being used, how people organize, how people meet, how information is shared. It's not done in a way that is reflective of these communities or is particularly engaging to them. And so I think a lot of times the people that we're talking about, the marginalized folks, they're marginalized. They're dealing with a number of layered issues that are preventing them from being active on this issue. If you're, a woman and you're trying to fight for, healthcare, being able to make decisions about your own body, that's a fire to you. If you're trying to keep your bills paid so you have a place to live and food to eat, that's a fire to you. You also care about climate change, but you can't fight all the battles all the time. Nobody can fight all the battles all the time. And I think what's unfortunate is that people take the absence of this community from being in the room as, oh, they don't care. Well, they do care. They're just fighting from a different angle, right? And I think a good example of this is when I talk about this a lot, but it was one of the clearest organizing examples I have of working on transit expansion. Transportation, major area for climate change, to address climate change, right? Major area for carbon emissions is to really dramatically reduce the number of single passenger vehicles on the road. So if I went into a community and I was like, hey, y'all, let's get public transit and let's take these cars off the road and stop burning oil and, cleaner air, people would be like, okay, yeah, that's nice, right? And they're okay, that's nice, but that's not, gonna get them off the couch. If I'm like, hey, we need to get transit because you need access to work, you need access to school. Your community is having a hard time getting around. People are moving out. You have vacancy rates that are sky high. It's really just destroying your quality of life in your community, in the home that you've bought. But we talked about those things, right? That was way more effective at getting somebody, I'm ready. What do you need me to do? Because they saw that this was something that was really important for them being able to survive, for their overall quality of life. And oh, look, hey, it's also going to give us some cleaner air and help us reduce some emissions. Because they did, trust me, when we were done with this whole effort, the community was saying that part. They did agree that they did want that cleaner air. It just wasn't the main thing, right? It wasn't the only thing that they wanted to organize around. So I think it's really important for us as organizers, as activists, as people who are in this field to really listen to what community is saying. Don't be dismissive. Don't try to tell people what their priorities are. Help them connect the dots between their stated priorities and what you're trying to do, and you're going to get a lot more traction every time. And so, yeah, I just want to repeat that women, communities of color, we already support this issue. We already support it. I think we just need to change our approach around how we organize it, do less campaigning. I'll also say the big thing in the environmental movement is just campaigns. Let's do a campaign for clean buses. Let's do a campaign to shut down this coal plant. Let's campaign and campaign. But in these campaigns, what we're failing to do is to equip the community with the tools and the leadership skills that they need to self-organize around these issues, even if there isn't a paid organizer or organization present, right? There's about 10 million people in the state of Georgia alone. There are just about as many environmental problems. And there's no way myself or all the organizations, environmental organizations in Georgia can adequately support all these communities. We need to give communities the skills so that they can take these fights on themselves. That's what I think is the next level of our movement and how we activate this base of people who we know are supporters.
That's man, such a great segue into talking about civic action, our civic duty, our civic responsibility. So Daphne, you started to really talk about the connection between voting and passing climate and clean energy policies, and what does it mean to us. We have midterms that are coming up, and I see in the chat that someone actually asked for you to repeat what that statistic was about Gen Z and the vote. I know Daphne mentioned, 4 million 18-year-olds are eligible every year. That turns into 8 million for midterms and 16 million for presidential elections. So if you could really dive into what can people do to become part of the entire voting process? I like to say voting is actually where it starts. That's not where your civic duty ends, though. So Daphne, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I always say that voting is the appetizer. It just opens up your palate, it just opens up your mindset to get started, really being a change maker within your community. And I think that for me, one of the ways that I help people get started is by giving agency to their feelings. When we talk about those who experience the brunt of the climate crisis, I always think about what the reality of environmental racism is. And for so long, I was experiencing environmental racism, and communities of color and communities like mine all over the country are experiencing it, but they do not have the language, they do not have the words to fully encompass everything that they're feeling. And specifically, also for Gen Z people my age, we're experiencing a lot of climate anxiety. Um, because our future is wholly uncertain more than any other generation in the past. And all of those feelings are really, really overwhelming. And I think un- one of the best ways we can invite people into this space is by saying, I see you and I hear you and I understand the feelings that you're feeling. And those feelings are not ones that should exist in a silo going off without a way to be contained. Turn those feelings into a way to uh, change your community, turn those feelings into action. And then how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? I always say that uh, community is where we are wholly accountable to, and community starts with conversation. So for me, when I got started in this work, I felt alone and I didn't have any friends. I didn't have other young people who I felt like were talking about the climate crisis with me. But it wasn't until I started asking those around me, have you noticed the same things that I've noticed, that I realized they were also thinking all the same things that I was. They just didn't feel like anybody was ever going to listen to them. So why voice these concerns in the first place? Um, so when we talk about voting, it's okay. Yes, are we registering folks to vote? Are we um, making sure they have barrier-free access to voting sites and poll sites? I always say one of the best ways to get involved is by volunteering to become a poll worker. You really see your community in action. You get to help be part of the electoral process. One of the most rewarding things is seeing your neighbors, seeing your friends and family come through your polling site and say, hey, I know them. I see a familiar face. We're all gathering here in community, working together to get our ballots in. But I also think that that's what happens after election day. What do we do after that? And the important thing is to remember that now is when the real work starts. Filling in those bubbles and putting the paper in the machine, that's easy. After that is where the hard work comes in, holding the people that you voted for accountable. And then the folks who win, whether or not you voted for those people or not, saying, okay, these are the demands, these are what my community needs from you. You represent us and not the other way around. Having folks understand that the status quo needs to go back to the way that it's always should have been, and maybe we never got there, but it's time that we do. And it's I always say that one of the easiest ways we can do that is by using our voice in various ways, letter writing campaigns, um, going to town halls, showing up and using your face, your body, your voice as a physical placeholder, as a physical, I always say, as a physical bookmark to say, I exist, my community exists, and I represent my community wherever I go. I always say that one of the most special things you can do in organizing is by being human megaphones, by letting the stories of our community pass through us, and amplifying them in spaces and in ways that maybe previously wouldn't have been able to. Um, an example that I wanted to give of this is in 2019, New York City passed a New York climate emergency bill, and in that bill there was funding given to move towards more electric and clean energy, and lots of infrastructure to protect us from the climate crisis. One of the main reasons that bill got passed is because of a huge letter writing campaign that young people initiated and created to the mayor's office of New York City. I myself wrote a letter every single day for a whole year to Bill de Blasio's office, our former mayor of New York City. And in every single one of those letters, I did something different. I would draw art. I would write poems. I would do something radically different because who knew what letter they were going to open. And if they were going to open every single one of my letters, I was going to make sure they were entertained and they were going to keep on the track of reading every single one of my 365 letters. And I think it's really easy to feel like, well, what is my one individual impact going to do? That's a question that I get a lot from people. I'm just one person who's going to listen to me, who's going to listen to my voice. And one person can change everything, can change the whole world. When we were collecting ballots for Box the Ballot in this last presidential election, we worked specifically in places like Pennsylvania and Arizona, and trying to work really hard on those swing states. And then some of the tiny, small county ballots that we got, we were able to flip those counties by sometimes 2 or 3 votes. That makes the difference so much. Those 2 or 3 extra people that came out, they made all the difference. So do not let anyone ever tell you that you don't matter, because you matter so much. And I think going forward, it's about realizing that there is nothing too small. Everything makes an impact. So whether it's writing letters with your friends, going out into your community and saying every weekend for the next 4 weekends, we're gonna uh, tend to our community gardens and plant trees in our community. We're going to go out and make sure that our streets are clean. We're going to go out and provide food and access to fresh food and resources for our community. All of those things matter because they compound on each other and build a sense of community. I think something that's the climate crisis does a lot is disintegrate our ideas of community, because it's easy to feel hopeless, it's easy to feel alone. But the way that we come together is by working in community and realizing that all of us together are going to be so much more powerful. I always say nothing about us without us. The movement talks about communities of color all the time, but instead of talking about us, wouldn't you much rather have examples? Wouldn't you much rather have rhetoric and language from us instead of letting someone speak for us? Let's speak for each other. And I think that that would be so much more powerful.
Wow. Our conversation is unfortunately about to end, but I hope everyone that is listening took in all of the gems from my fellow panelists here. I'm Jasmine Davenport. We had Briante McCorkle and Daphne Frias. If you two would like to share your social media handles so people can follow you, Briante, what's yours?
It's at Briante. So at MBRIONTE.
Awesome.
And Daphne, what is yours?
Mine is at Frias_Daphne. So that's FRIAS_DAPHNE.
Awesome. And you've heard it here. I'm Jazzy Climate at JAZZY Climate. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Lean into your joy, and that increases your impact.